Americans are obsessed with Christmas movies, and you're clearly obsessed with royalty, so why not?
The statement from Buckingham Palace was 9 sentences long and destroyed a marriage in under 2 minutes. Comprehensive DNA analysis confirmed Prince Harry was not Archie's biological father. What followed wasn't just a scandal, it was the total annihilation of everything Harry and Meghan had built on a foundation of carefully constructed lies. The bombshell announcement. The statement that appeared on Buckingham Palace's official platforms at 6:23 a.m. GMT was crafted by lawyers, reviewed by constitutional experts, and approved at the highest levels of government. Its clinical language barely concealed the nuclear explosion it was designed to detonate. Following comprehensive legal review and DNA analysis conducted through appropriate channels, the palace must formally address succession questions regarding Archie Harrison Mountbatten Windsor, born May 6, 2019. Recent evidence, obtained through lawful investigation and verified by independent laboratories, conclusively demonstrates that Prince Henry Charles Albert David, Duke of Sussex, is not the biological father of the child known as Archie. The statement continued with devastating precision. This determination has been made through genetic testing using samples obtained legally with appropriate court authorization. The testing was conducted by 3 separate accredited facilities to ensure accuracy beyond any reasonable doubt. All results were consistent. There is no biological relationship between the Duke of Sussex and Archie Mountbatten Windsor. What made the statement particularly explosive was what came next. As this child has been included in the line of succession based on presumed paternity, this revelation creates immediate constitutional implications. Under British succession law, inclusion in the line of succession requires proven descent from the qualifying royal line. Archie Mountbatten Windsor does not meet this requirement. His position in the line of succession is therefore void. The statement concluded with language that legal experts immediately recognized as preparing for criminal investigation. The circumstances surrounding this deception are under active investigation. Questions regarding who knew what information and when, and whether fraudulent claims were made regarding succession rights, are being examined by appropriate authorities. Further statements will be issued as the investigation progresses. The reaction was instantaneous chaos. Within 10 minutes, every major news organization globally had interrupted regular programming. Within 20 minutes, Archie paternity was trending worldwide across all social media platforms. Within 30 minutes, British constitutional experts were being rushed onto television to explain the unprecedented nature of what had just been revealed. But the most significant reaction was happening in Montecito, California, where it was 10:23 p.m. on December 2nd. Harry had been preparing for bed when his phone began exploding with notifications. Security advisors, lawyers, family contacts, all trying to reach him urgently. When he'd opened the palace statement, witnesses later reported his face had drained of all color. According to multiple sources who spoke to the media in subsequent days, Harry had initially thought the statement was a hack, a cruel hoax designed to humiliate him. He'd called his UK lawyers immediately, demanding they confirm whether the palace had actually released such a statement. When they'd confirmed it was genuine, that the palace was officially declaring he wasn't Archie's biological father, Harry had reportedly said only, "That's impossible. This is insane." But within minutes, as the full implications began settling over him, something had shifted. Witnesses described him becoming disoriented, his breathing rapid and shallow, his speech confused. Meghan had apparently tried to calm him, but her attempts had only agitated him further. When she'd tried to explain, to tell him there were reasons, complexities he didn't understand, Harry had looked at her with an expression those present would later describe as complete devastation. The medical emergency had occurred around 11 p.m. Pacific time. Harry had collapsed, later determined to be a combination of hyperventilation, shock-induced panic attack, and emotional breakdown so severe that Meghan had called emergency services. Paramedics had arrived at the Sussex residence within 12 minutes, treating Harry at the scene before determining the required hospital evaluation for potential cardiac symptoms and psychological crisis. The scene at the hospital, described later by staff who leaked information despite confidentiality requirements, was heartbreaking. Harry, the prince who'd served in Afghanistan, who'd seemed so strong and protective, was essentially catatonic, unable to process what he'd learned. Medical professionals treating him reported he kept repeating variations of, "I'm his father, I know I'm his father," as though saying it enough times could make it true. Meghan had arrived at the hospital behind the ambulance, and her demeanor, according to those who witnessed it, was that of someone in crisis management mode rather than emotional devastation. She'd been on her phone constantly, coordinating with lawyers, with PR advisors, with contacts in the UK. Her focus appeared to be on controlling the narrative rather than on Harry's medical condition, a detail that would later become significant in analyzing her role in the deception. At Kensington Palace, William had been informed of the palace statement 30 minutes before its release, standard protocol given his position as heir. His reaction, according to sources present, had been complicated. There was vindication that his long-held suspicions about Sussex deceptions had been proven correct. But there was also genuine distress for his brother, understanding that Harry was facing not just public humiliation, but the potential destruction of his understanding of his own family. Catherine had reportedly been the one to ask the question everyone was thinking. Does Harry actually know? Or is he finding this out the same time as the rest of the world? The answer, confirmed through channels, was that Harry had not been informed in advance. The palace had made the calculated decision to release the statement without warning, specifically to avoid giving the Sussexes opportunity to craft a preemptive narrative or flee jurisdiction before legal proceedings could be initiated. Princess Anne's reaction was characteristically pragmatic when briefed on the situation. "This is a constitutional necessity, not a family matter," she'd stated firmly. "If the child isn't biologically descended from the qualifying line, he cannot be in succession. Personal feelings are irrelevant to legal reality." But even Anne, not typically given to emotional displays, had acknowledged the human cost. Harry's collapse is regrettable, but it doesn't change what must be done. King Charles, informed of Harry's hospitalization shortly after the statement's release, had reportedly been torn between paternal concern and institutional duty. He'd wanted to call Harry directly, but palace advisors had counseled against it until the legal situation was clarified. Any communication between Charles and Harry could be subpoenaed in potential fraud investigations, and expressing sympathy could be interpreted as the king acknowledging uncertainty about the palace's legal position. By dawn GMT, the story had consumed every news cycle globally. Medical experts were explaining how DNA testing was conducted and verified. Legal scholars were analyzing succession law implications, and royal commentators were connecting dots that should have been connected years earlier. Patterns in how Archie's birth had been handled that now made devastating sense in light of the paternity revelation. The most frequently asked question, repeated across every platform and broadcast, was simple but impossible to answer with certainty. Had Harry known? Was he a victim of his wife's deception? Or had he been complicit in a fraud that affected the constitutional line of succession to the British throne? The investigation that led. Here, the palace investigation that culminated in the devastating announcement had begun not with suspicion about paternity, but with a seemingly unrelated matter that had gradually uncovered evidence too significant to ignore. Understanding how the palace arrived at the decision to publicly question Archie's paternity requires tracing the investigative timeline that began nearly 8 months before the bombshell statement. The catalyst had been a routine legal review in April 2025, part of broader palace efforts to ensure all succession-related documentation was properly maintained and legally defensible. During this review, legal clerks had noticed irregularities in documentation surrounding Archie's birth, The birth certificate, while legally valid, contained details that seemed inconsistent with standard procedures. Small things initially, but enough to warrant closer examination. When senior legal advisors had dug deeper, they'd discovered that the hospital listed on Archie's birth certificate, Portland Hospital, had no record of Megan being admitted for delivery on the dates surrounding his birth. Hospital administrators, responding to properly authorized legal inquiries, had confirmed that while they'd been told to expect a royal birth, Megan had never actually been admitted as a patient. The birth certificate listed Portland Hospital, but the birth had apparently occurred elsewhere. This discovery had triggered expanded investigation. If the Sussexes had lied about the hospital, what else might be inaccurate? Palace investigators, working with private security firms specialized in discreet inquiries, had begun piecing together the timeline of Archie's conception and birth. The breakthrough had come in June, when an anonymous tip had been received through a secure legal channel. The tipster, who claimed to be a former employee at a Los Angeles fertility clinic, alleged that Meghan and Harry had used donor sperm for IVF procedures that resulted in Archie's conception. The tip included specific dates, clinic names, and enough verifiable detail that Palace legal advisors determined it required serious investigation rather than dismissal as conspiracy theory. Private investigators hired by Palace lawyers had traced the fertility clinic records. Using legal authority granted through British courts with jurisdiction over succession matters, they'd obtained records showing that Meghan had indeed been a patient at the clinic during the time frame when Archie would have been conceived. The records showed multiple IVF cycles, embryo transfers, and, significantly, documentation of donor sperm usage. The donor's identity was protected under California privacy law and clinic policy, but the records made clear that the genetic material used to create the embryo that became Archie had not come from Prince Harry. Medical records showed Harry had provided samples for testing, but those samples had not been used in the successful embryo creation. Instead, an anonymous donor's sperm had been combined with Meghan's egg. The question that immediately consumed investigators was whether Harry had known. The clinic records were ambiguous on this point. They showed consent forms signed by both Harry and Meghan for IVF procedures generally, but the specific consent for donor sperm usage showed only Meghan's signature. This could mean Harry hadn't been present when that particular decision was made, or it could mean he'd been aware but had chosen not to sign documentation himself. Additional investigation revealed that Meghan and Harry had been dealing with fertility challenges that had not been publicly disclosed. Medical records showed Harry had significant sperm motility issues that made natural conception unlikely and reduced the success rate of IVF using his genetic material. The couple had apparently undergone several failed IVF attempts using Harry's sperm before the decision was made to use a donor. Princess Anne had been brought into the investigation in July when the donor sperm evidence had been confirmed. As one of the most senior working royals and someone with a reputation for unflinching assessment of difficult situations, Anne had been asked to review the evidence and advise on how to proceed. Her response had been immediate and unequivocal. If the child isn't biologically Harry's, the public has been deceived about succession. We need definitive DNA confirmation, and we need it through legal channels that will withstand any challenge. The DNA testing authorization had required extensive legal maneuvering. British courts had authority over succession matters, but obtaining biological samples from a child living in California under his parents' custody presented jurisdictional and practical challenges. Palace lawyers had worked with U.S. legal authorities, eventually obtaining court orders that authorized DNA sample collection during Archie's required medical appointments. The actual sample collection had occurred in August at a California pediatric facility during what Archie's parents believed was a routine wellness check. Medical staff, operating under court seal and legal authorization, had collected cheek swabs that were then sent to 3 separate accredited DNA laboratories. 2 were in the United States, 1 in Switzerland, all operating under chain of custody protocols, that would make the results defensible in any legal proceeding. The results had come back in September, and they were unanimous and unambiguous. The genetic markers showed no biological relationship between Prince Harry and Archie Mountbatten-Windsor, the child who'd been presented to the world as sixth in line to the British throne, had no genetic connection to the royal family at all. King Charles had been informed on September 23rd, during a meeting that those present described as one of the most difficult of his reign. Senior advisors had presented him with the DNA results, the fertility clinic records, and the investigative timeline. Charles's first response had been to question whether there could be any error, any possibility the results were wrong. When assured that 3 independent laboratories using samples with verified chain of custody had reached identical conclusions, Charles had asked the question that defined his moral struggle: does Harry know? The answer, based on all available evidence, appeared to be that Harry probably didn't know, at least not with certainty. The fertility clinic records suggested Meghan might have made the donor decision independently during one of the many medical appointments Harry hadn't attended. Whether she'd told him afterward, whether he'd suspected, or whether he'd been kept completely in the dark remained unclear, but the evidence suggested Harry was more likely a victim of deception than a willing participant in fraud. William had been briefed in early October, and his reaction had combined vindication with genuine sadness for his brother. William had long suspected the Sussexes weren't being truthful about various aspects of their lives, but discovering Harry might not be Archie's biological father was more dramatic than even William's cynicism had anticipated. If Meghan did this without Harry's knowledge, William had said during the briefing, then she's perpetrated the cruelest deception imaginable, and if Harry did know, then he's committed fraud against the crown. Either way, this is catastrophic. The decision to go public rather than handle the matter privately had been made in November after extensive legal and constitutional consultation. The palace's legal advisors had determined that because Archie had been included in the official line of succession, the deception affected constitutional matters of public interest. Handling it privately would be concealing information that citizens had a right to know, particularly given ongoing debates about royal funding and transparency. The timing of the announcement had been calculated. December was chosen specifically because Parliament was in session, allowing immediate legislative response if needed. The lack of advance warning to Harry was deliberate, designed to prevent the Sussexes from crafting a misleading counter-narrative before the truth was established. And the clinical legalistic language was chosen to emphasize this was constitutional necessity rather than personal vendetta. As investigators compiled their final report in November, one question remained hauntingly unanswered. When would Harry learn the truth, and how would he react to discovering that his understanding of his family, his son's identity, and potentially his entire marriage had been built on a deception more profound than anything he'd accused his own family of perpetrating? The truth about conception. The detailed medical and legal records that emerged in the days following the palace announcement painted a picture of fertility struggles, difficult decisions, and potentially catastrophic deception that transformed the Sussex story from royal drama into human tragedy. The timeline began in late 2017, shortly after Harry and Meghan's engagement was announced. According to medical records that became part of legal proceedings, Meghan had consulted fertility specialists in London within weeks of the engagement, expressing concern about her age. She was 36 at the time, and her desire to conceive quickly once married. Initial fertility assessments had been encouraging for Meghan. Her egg quality and ovarian reserve were within normal ranges for her age. But when Harry had undergone testing, as is standard protocol for couples pursuing fertility evaluation, the results had been concerning. Harry's sperm count was adequate, but motility rates were significantly below optimal levels, likely related to his military service exposure to various environmental factors and possible impact from his well-documented years of heavy drinking in his 20s. The couple had begun trying to conceive naturally after their May 2018 wedding, but by September of that year, Meghan had pushed for more aggressive intervention. Medical records showed she'd consulted with Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a prominent Los Angeles fertility specialist, during a trip to California. Dr. Rodriguez had recommended IVF given Harry's test results and Meghan's age, suggesting that waiting for natural conception could waste time they didn't have. The first IVF cycle had taken place in November 2018 at a private London clinic. Using Harry's sperm and Meghan's eggs, they'd created 4 embryos, 2 of which were considered viable for transfer. The first transfer had failed to result in pregnancy. The second, in January 2019, had also failed. Medical notes from this period showed Meghan becoming increasingly frustrated and anxious, expressing concern that her advancing age was working against them. It was after the second failed cycle that the question of donor sperm had apparently been raised. Medical records showed that Dr. Rodriguez had discussed the option with Meghan during a consultation in February 2019. The doctor's notes were clinical but revealing. Patient expressing significant distress about failed cycles. Discussed option of donor sperm given male partner's motility issues. Patient very interested, but concerned about partner's response to suggestion. What happened next remained the subject of intense speculation and legal scrutiny. Clinic records showed that in late February 2019, Meghan had signed consent forms for IVF using donor sperm. The consent form had a line for partner signature, but it was blank. Clinic policy required partner consent for donor procedures, but there appeared to be a notation that partner consent obtained verbally, unavailable for signature due to travel commitments. Whether Harry had actually provided verbal consent, whether he'd been informed at all, or whether the clinic had been misled about Harry's agreement became the central question. Legal experts analyzing the records noted that the documentation was suspiciously thin for such a significant decision, suggesting either irregularities in clinic procedures or deliberate obscuring of the consent process. The donor himself had been selected from an anonymous sperm bank database. California law protected donor anonymity, but investigative journalists and legal authorities examining the case had traced certain details. The donor profile showed someone of similar height and coloring to Harry, suggesting deliberate selection to ensure physical resemblance. Medical and educational background indicated high intelligence and good health, but crucially, the donor had no genetic connection to British royalty or any relationship to Harry beyond superficial physical similarity. The IVF cycle using donor sperm had taken place in March 2019. 2 embryos had been created, and 1 had been transferred on March 23rd. The pregnancy had been confirmed on April 5th, and Meghan's visible pregnancy progression throughout the spring had been real. Whatever questions existed about conception, she had carried and delivered Archie, even if the genetic material that created him hadn't come from her husband. The birth itself had taken place not at Portland Hospital as the birth certificate claimed, but at a private facility in Windsor, according to staff who came forward after the palace announcement. The decision to list Portland Hospital on official documentation had apparently been made to maintain consistency with public statements that had been issued prematurely, before the Sussexes had finalized their birth plan. What made the deception particularly complex was the question of when, if ever, Harry had been told the full truth. Some evidence suggested he might have known from the beginning. His behavior during the pregnancy announcement and Archie's first public appearances had been analyzed extensively after the scandal broke, with body language experts suggesting high levels of stress and anxiety that could indicate knowledge of a secret he was helping conceal. Other evidence suggested Harry might have been kept in darkness or given partial information that allowed him to maintain plausible deniability. Friends of Harry who spoke anonymously to the media described him as someone who desperately wanted to be a father, who might have been willing to overlook details or avoid asking difficult questions if it meant achieving that goal. One friend stated, "Harry wanted a family so badly. If Meghan told him they needed donor assistance and framed it as a minor medical detail, he might have agreed without fully understanding or wanting to know the implications. The legal contracts surrounding the donor arrangement added another layer of complexity. Standard sperm donation agreements include clauses establishing that the donor relinquishes all parental rights and that the recipient becomes the legal parent. But these contracts typically assume the recipient is the person who will carry and birth the child or is legally married to that person at the time of conception. In Harry and Meghan's case, the legal parentage was clear under California law. They were both legal parents regardless of genetic connection, assuming proper consent had been obtained. But British succession law operated under different principles. Inclusion in the line of succession required proven biological descent from the qualifying royal line. Legal parentage under California law couldn't override constitutional requirements for succession in the United Kingdom. The identity of the donor became subject of intense media speculation once the scandal broke, though California law prevented official disclosure. Several men came forward claiming to be the biological father, seeking either attention or financial benefit, but without DNA verification, their claims remained unproven. The clinic maintained absolute refusal to disclose donor information, citing both legal requirements and ethical obligations to protect donor privacy. What emerged with increasing clarity as more information surfaced was that Archie's conception had involved decisions made under stress, with questionable consent procedures, possibly with deliberate concealment from Harry, and certainly with catastrophic implications for both the Sussex family and the constitutional line of succession that no one involved had adequately considered or prepared for. Harry's collapse and aftermath. The medical emergency that began with Harry's collapse at his Montecito home on the evening of December 2nd revealed the devastating human cost of the palace's calculated disclosure and the possible deception that had preceded it. Emergency room physicians at Santa Barbara Cottage Hospital who treated Harry described a patient in an acute psychological crisis. His initial presentation showed symptoms consistent with panic attack, rapid heart rate, hyperventilation, chest pain, and disorientation. But as medical staff stabilized his physical symptoms, the psychological dimensions became more apparent and more concerning. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the emergency physician who initially assessed Harry, later testified in legal proceedings about his mental state. He was cycling between denial, rage, and complete emotional collapse, she stated. He would insist the palace statement was a lie, then demand to know how they could prove it, then break down crying, asking how this could be happening. It was clear he was processing information that fundamentally altered his understanding of his reality. The most heartbreaking aspect of Harry's breakdown, according to medical staff who witnessed it, was his repeated insistence that he was Archie's father. "I know I'm his father," he'd reportedly said over and over. "I've held him. I've raised him. I'm his father." The distinction between biological paternity and social fatherhood seemed to be something Harry couldn't process in his acute emotional state. Meghan had arrived at the hospital approximately 30 minutes after Harry, and her interaction with medical staff was notably different from Harry's emotional devastation. Multiple hospital employees later described her as composed, focused, and primarily concerned with controlling information flow rather than with Harry's emotional state. She'd asked repeatedly about privacy protocols, about who had access to Harry's medical information, about whether the media had been alerted to his hospitalization. The conversation between Harry and Meghan in his hospital room, partially overheard by staff despite efforts at privacy, was described as explosive. Harry had apparently demanded to know whether he'd known about the donor sperm, whether he'd been informed and had simply forgotten or repressed the information, or whether he'd been deliberately deceived. Meghan's responses, according to those who overheard fragments, were defensive and legalistic, focusing on consent forms he'd signed and conversations they'd had about fertility assistance without apparently addressing the direct question of whether she'd explicitly told him donor sperm would be used. The psychiatric evaluation that was part of Harry's emergency treatment revealed someone experiencing acute traumatic stress. The psychologist who consulted described Harry as showing symptoms consistent with sudden identity disruption. His understanding of who he was, what his family was, and what his marriage meant had been fundamentally challenged in a way that threatened his psychological integrity. Harry was kept at the hospital overnight for observation, with security measures preventing media access, but not preventing word of his collapse from spreading. By morning, California time on December 3rd, every news organization globally was reporting that Prince Harry had been hospitalized following the paternity revelation, with speculation ranging from heart attack to suicide attempt before accurate details about panic attack and psychological crisis emerged. The Sussex legal team had mobilized within hours of Harry's collapse, but their strategy seemed confused and reactive rather than prepared. Initial statements denied the palace's claims without providing counter-evidence. Subsequent statements threatened legal action without specifying grounds. And by the end of the first day, Sussex lawyers were acknowledging that DNA testing had occurred while disputing its interpretation and relevance. The strain on Harry and Meghan's marriage was immediately apparent to everyone around them. Staff at the Montecito home, speaking anonymously to media, described a couple barely speaking to each other, with Harry spending most of his time in separate areas of the house, refusing meals, and declining to interact with Archie or Lilibet. One staff member stated, "He can't look at Archie without breaking down, and he can't look at Meghan without visible anger. Their marriage is effectively over, even if they're not ready to admit it." Meghan's response strategy, as it became clear through her team's communications, was to frame this as a privacy violation rather than address the underlying truth of the paternity question. Her public relations team issued statements condemning the palace for weaponizing private medical information and violating family privacy for political purposes. But notably, none of the statements actually denied that donor sperm had been used or that Harry wasn't Archie's biological father. William's private reaction to Harry's collapse, according to palace sources, was complicated. There was no satisfaction in watching his brother experience such devastation, but there was also frustration that Harry hadn't been honest with himself or the family about the circumstances of Archie's conception. When asked whether he would reach out to Harry directly, William had reportedly said, "What would I say? I'm sorry you're learning you might not be your son's biological father, but I'm not sorry the truth is coming out. He needs to deal with this with Meghan, not with me." Catherine had been more sympathetic, privately expressing the view that Harry was likely a victim of Meghan's deception rather than a willing participant in fraud. She'd urged William to maintain some avenue of communication, arguing that Harry would need family support as his marriage potentially disintegrated. But William had been resistant, arguing that any contact could be interpreted as the palace wavering in its position about the succession implications. As Harry was released from the hospital on December 4th, medical professionals emphasized he needed ongoing psychological support. The trauma of discovering, whether for the first time or having it publicly confirmed, that he wasn't his son's biological father, would require extensive therapy to process. But the public nature of the revelation, the constitutional implications, and the potential legal consequences facing both him and Meghan meant that private healing would be nearly impossible to achieve. The constitutional crisis. The 72 hours following the palace's paternity announcement witnessed a constitutional crisis that threatened to fundamentally reshape British succession law, the monarchy's relationship with Parliament, and public understanding of what royal bloodline meant in the modern era. The immediate constitutional question was straightforward but unprecedented. If Archie wasn't biologically descended from the royal line, could he remain in the succession? The answer, according to constitutional experts consulted by Parliament, was unambiguous. British succession law was based on bloodline descent from Sophia of Hanover, as established by the Act of Settlement 1701. Without biological descent from the qualifying royal line, there was no legal basis for inclusion in the succession, regardless of legal parentage under other jurisdictions' family law. Parliament convened in emergency session on December 4th to address the constitutional implications. The debate revealed deep divisions about how to handle a situation without clear precedent. Some MPs argued for immediate legislative action formally removing Archie from the line of succession. Others suggested waiting for legal proceedings to conclude before Parliament acted. A few voices, largely drowned out by the majority, questioned whether bloodline-based succession was appropriate for the 21st century at all. The government's position, presented by the Attorney General, was that Archie's removal from succession was legally automatic based on the DNA evidence. He had been incorrectly included due to false presumption of paternity, but that inclusion had never been legally valid. Therefore, no parliamentary action was required to remove him. Rather, official succession documents would simply be corrected to reflect genetic reality. But this position created complications regarding who'd had authority to make that determination. If the palace could unilaterally decide succession questions based on DNA testing, what prevented future monarchs from using genetic testing to manipulate succession? The constitutional principle that Parliament, not the Crown, controlled succession rules was potentially undermined by the palace's independent investigation and announcement. The question of Lilibet's paternity immediately became the subject of intense speculation. If Archie had been conceived using donor sperm, had the same method been used for Lilibet? The palace's statement had addressed only Archie specifically, but legal experts noted that the investigative methodology used could easily be applied to Lilibet as well. Rumors circulated that DNA testing of Lilibet was already underway or had been completed, with results being withheld pending resolution of the Archie situation. Harry's position as Duke of Sussex also came under legal scrutiny. Titles granted by the Crown could theoretically be removed if the recipient had obtained them through fraud or had committed acts inconsistent with the dignity of the peerage. If Harry had knowingly participated in deception about Archie's paternity to fraudulently place a non-royal child in the succession, that could constitute grounds for title removal. But if Harry had been deceived by Meghan, then punishing him for her deception seemed unjust. The most serious legal implications involved potential fraud charges against Meghan. Multiple legal experts suggested that if she'd deliberately concealed donor sperm usage, particularly if she'd misled Harry about it, and had then presented Archie as biologically Harry's child for purposes of succession inclusion, she could potentially face charges of fraud against the Crown. Such charges carried serious legal penalties and could result in extradition requests from the UK to US authorities. California authorities faced their own jurisdictional questions. While Archie's legal parentage under California family law was clear, Harry and Meghan were his legal parents regardless of genetics. Potential fraud regarding British succession was outside California's legal jurisdiction. Whether California would cooperate with British extradition requests or legal proceedings became a subject of international law analysis and political consideration. Commonwealth nations watched the crisis with mixture of concern and fascination. In countries where the British monarch served as head of state, questions about succession line integrity had direct constitutional implications. Several Commonwealth prime ministers issued statements emphasizing the importance of maintaining clear, legally sound succession rules. A few used the crisis to renew calls for their nations to become republics, arguing that hereditary monarchy based on bloodline was fundamentally outdated and problematic. Public reaction remained intensely divided. Polling showed approximately 40% of Britons believed the palace had acted appropriately in revealing the paternity truth, arguing that succession questions were matters of public interest that outweighed privacy concerns. About 35% believed the palace had overreached, suggesting that DNA testing of children without parental consent was inappropriate, regardless of succession implications. The remaining 25% remained undecided or felt the situation was too complex for simple judgments. Support for Harry personally ran higher than support for his position. Many Britons expressed sympathy for Harry as a potential victim of deception, while still believing Archie couldn't remain in succession, if not biologically royal. The ability to hold both "Harry deserves compassion" and "the succession law must be upheld" simultaneously showed sophisticated public understanding of the crisis's complexity. The international media's coverage reflected geographical and cultural biases. American outlets largely framed the story as the British establishment attacking Meghan, with racial undertones noted by several commentators. British media focused more on constitutional propriety and succession law. European coverage emphasized the legal and procedural questions, while largely avoiding the personal dimensions. Social media became a battleground of competing narratives. Sussex supporters insisted the palace had violated medical privacy and was punishing Harry for leaving royal life. Royal supporters argued that succession fraud was unacceptable regardless of how sympathetic Harry's situation might be. Reasonable middle ground was difficult to find in the polarized online discourse. Behind the scenes, palace officials were coordinating with government lawyers to prepare for multiple legal contingencies. If Meghan refused to cooperate with further investigations, what enforcement mechanisms existed? If Harry sought to challenge the DNA results, what procedures would govern that challenge? If the Sussexes fled California to avoid legal proceedings, what options did British authorities have? As December continued, one reality became inescapable. The constitutional crisis sparked by Archie's paternity would take years to fully resolve through legal proceedings, parliamentary action, and public discourse. The immediate questions of succession inclusion could be answered relatively quickly, but the broader questions about privacy, royal bloodline relevance, and constitutional limits on palace authority would define debate for years to come. What had begun as a shocking revelation about one child's paternity had evolved into a comprehensive examination of what monarchy meant in an era of genetic testing, international family law complexities, and declining deference to traditional authority. The British constitutional order was being stress-tested in ways no one had anticipated, and the outcome would shape royal succession rules for generations. In the end, the cruelest truth emerged. Secrets don't protect families, they detonate them from within. Deception compounds like interest until the weight becomes catastrophic. DNA doesn't lie, and the innocent always pay the highest price. Archie would spend a lifetime paying for choices made before he was even born.